There are several passages in the book of Revelation supporting the idea that the church will face the Antichrist persecution just before the rapture, and that both the rapture and the day of the Lord will not begin until after the midpoint of the 7-year period. This is all, of course, contrary to the traditional pre-trib model, which teaches that the rapture will occur before the 7-year period begins. In the book of Revelation, most of the events that take place in the book correspond to various stages of a symbolic scroll being opened. For example, there are 7 seals on the scroll, and each time a seal is removed, a prophetic event takes place. After all 7 of the seals are removed, 7 angels with 7 trumpets are introduced, and one at a time, each angel blows their trumpet, and a new prophetic event takes place, until finally 7 angels with 7 bowls of wrath appear, and 7 more events take place. There are a variety of different viewpoints in pre-tribulationism as to the exact timing of the events that correspond to these seals, trumpets, and bowls. The main difference between pre-tribulationism and pre-wrath in this regard is that most pre-tribulationists believed that all the seals in Revelation chapter 6, as well as the trumpets and bowls found in later chapters, are events that take place during the day of the Lord's wrath. Pre-wrathers believe the 7 seals on the outside of this proverbial scroll are not the wrath of God, but rather only the contents of the scroll, represented in the book by the trumpets and bowls, are the day of the Lord's wrath.
And so these 7 seals are preconditions that need to be met before the scroll is opened. It is only after all 7 seals are broken that the scroll can be opened, and then the wrath of God unfolds. And this is exactly what we see in the flow of Revelation 6 through 8.
Pre-wrathers point out that the events that take place during the seals are mostly things that are the direct result of the Antichrist's evil workings, not the result of God's wrath. For example, the first seal is the introduction of the Antichrist as the rider on the white horse. The second seal is about the wars that the Antichrist will fight as he gains power. Then, in the next 2 seals, you have famines and people being killed in large numbers, quote, with the sword. The 5th seal is an interesting one, and this is where many pre-wrathers begin their argument that these seals cannot be a part of God's wrath.
The martyrs that are depicted in the Revelation at the 5th seal, in my opinion, is one of the strongest arguments for the pre-wrath position.
Pre-tribulationists claim that the seals on the scroll, the 7-sealed scroll, the seals are all of God's wrath. But that's contradicted by the 5th seal. In Revelation 6:9 it says, "Now when the Lamb opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been violently killed because of the word of God and because of the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, 'How long, sovereign master, holy and true, before you judge those who live on the earth and avenge our blood?' Each of them was given a long white robe, and they were told to rest for a little longer until the full number was reached of both their fellow servants and their brothers who were going to be killed just as they have been."
But they asked God, when are you going to start your wrath on the people on the earth who are responsible for our death? That is powerful, in my opinion, because to me, that explicitly declares that the wrath of God, that eschatological wrath, has not begun.
How long, O Lord, until you vindicate our blood on those who dwell on the earth? In other words, it hasn't been happening yet up to the 5th seal. And they're told, wait a little while until the rest of your brethren are killed. And then the 6th seal is open and the great day of God's wrath has arrived.
There are very few pre-trib responses to this issue, but one example is from Robert Thomas, who, though he doesn't say it directly, implies that what the martyrs were actually doing is crying out for God's wrath to finish. In other words, the martyrs are crying out for the end of God's wrath, not for God's wrath to begin. The problem, of course, is that the plain reading in both the Greek and English of this phrase, "How long before you judge and avenge our blood," means that no judgment of any kind has begun at that point. This is reiterated in the next verse when God tells them to wait a little while longer until the full number of Christian martyrs are killed. Both grammatically and contextually, God has not begun his judgment on the wicked at this point, which is probably why we found so few pre-trib commentators willing to try to explain this passage at all. This causes another problem for pre-tribbers, because if God's wrath has begun by this point, as they say, it would mean that these Christian martyrs in the fifth seal had been going through God's wrath, which contradicts the doctrine that Christians will not go through the wrath of God, derived from 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 9 and other places, a doctrine that is agreed upon by all sides of this debate.
God promises that believers will not have to experience the wrath of God, the day of the Lord's wrath. And yet, pre-tribulationists contradict themselves when they say that the fifth seal is God's wrath. You can't have both.
Pre-tribulationists try to get around this by calling these Christians tribulation saints. They define tribulation saints as people left behind in the rapture who become Christians during the day of the Lord.
Well, a common argument that I hear often is that, these believers, they're not, quote unquote, part of the church. They're quote unquote tribulation saints. And they'll even go to the extent, not all of them, but some of them will actually say, because they didn't accept Christ before the rapture, this is like a certain judgment on them. I'm sorry, that's absurd. And it also, again, it contradicts what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, is that we are promised exemption from God's wrath.
Some pre-tribulationists, Bill Salus for one, have proposed an entirely new theory which removes the fifth seal from the 70th week altogether. Salus places the first 5 seals before the 7-year period, which avoids the fifth seal martyr problem. But this model is almost unheard of in pre-trib circles. While many pre-tribbers argue about where to put the first 3 seals, and some pre-tribbers do in fact put the first 3 seals before the 7-year period begins, placing the 4th and 5th seals before the 7 years is fairly radical, because they have such strong ties to the midpoint of the 7-year period. But it does have the one benefit of keeping these 5th seal martyrs out of the wrath of God, and thus avoiding this major contradiction. The next bit of evidence to which pre-wrathers point to show that the wrath of God has not begun during the seals is the celestial disturbance sign found in the next seal, the 6th seal. This is the sign which Joel 2 verse 31 says will occur before the day of the Lord. So if this sign in the sun, moon, and stars in Revelation 6 is the same one that Joel talked about, then the day of the Lord cannot have begun by this point, because this sign happens before the day of the Lord begins. We see evidence that this cosmic disturbance sign in Revelation 6 is in fact the same one that announces the day of the Lord's wrath, because as a result of people seeing this sign in the heavens, we see the following reaction. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" Revelation 6, verses 15 to 17. Here again, a plain reading shows that the people of the earth believe that the wrath of God is about to begin at the 6th seal.
The earth dwellers are diving into the rocks because it is now time for the day of recompense, for the day of repaying the world for persecuting the people of God.
In an attempt to deal with this damning evidence that the seals cannot be the wrath of God, pre-tribbers will typically argue about the tense form of the Greek word for has come in Revelation 6 verse 17, Many pre-tribbers say that since the phrase has come is in the Greek aorist tense form, it is in the past tense. In this case, they would prefer a translation such as the wrath of God has been occurring.
Pre-tribulationists generally want to argue the day of the Lord began with the first seal. And so when people say the great day of God's wrath has arrived, all they're doing is finally recognizing that they've been experiencing the great day of God's wrath.
A growing number of Greek scholars strongly disagree with this idea, pointing out that the reason any Greek word is rendered in the past, present, or future tense is determined by the context, not from Greek tense form. This can be seen by reviewing other instances in the Bible, including in Revelation 19, verse 7, where the aorist indicative tense form is clearly not supposed to be translated in the past tense. It says, "The wedding of the Lamb has come," which is obviously not supposed to be translated, "The wedding of the Lamb has already come."
Take the text at face value. Allow the text to speak. The fact that the aorist is used more than 11 times in that sixth seal, all of a sudden, just the one occurrence of it, though, has such high and important significance, seems to me to betray the very system you're trying to build.
Also, consider the actions of the people in this verse. They are hiding themselves in the rocks, because they saw the very same sign Joel said would herald the wrath of God. These people didn't hide themselves during the first 5 seals. What has changed other than the celestial announcement that the wrath of God was about to begin? Another line of evidence for the pre-wrath position in Revelation 6 comes from the recognition that the 6 seals line up perfectly with the teaching of Christ during his Olivet Discourse.
Revelation 6 is a revelation to a lot of people when you start to compare it to Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse. And this is a very key part of pre-wrath rapturism. It's actually something that was key to me really coming into the position. Juxtaposing both the flow of Matthew 24 and Revelation chapter 6 shows a lot of parallels.
The opening of the seals is parallel to the elements of Jesus' discussion in Matthew 24. So the rider on the white horse corresponds to the false Christs. The rider on the red horse is war. The black horse is famine. The sickly horse is death. And then there's martyrs.
The first 3 seals, these are corresponded to Jesus' beginning birth pains. The 4th seal is correlated to the persecution of the Antichrist's Great Tribulation. And the 5th seal is part of the Great Tribulation too, but it's showing a result of the persecution, and that is martyrdom. That's why it's called the 5th seal, martyrs.
In case there is any doubt we are on the right track, the next thing mentioned after the persecution in Matthew 24 is the celestial disturbances sign in the sun, moon, and stars, which we now know means the day of the Lord is about to begin. We see this exact same sign in the 6th seal, which all but confirms that this parallel between Matthew and the seals in Revelation 6 is correct.
In the book of Revelation, in exactly the right location as you're reading it sequentially, you'll find a clear discussion of something happening to the sun, the moon, and the stars. This is the clear identifier, indicator that God's wrath is about to commence. It is about to pour down on a wicked world.
Now, the reason why this is so key is because in both the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation, we have this sign occurring. And that which occurs in the wake of this sign is an indication of deliverance. It is immediately after the distress of those days that Jesus appears in great power and glory and gathers his elect from the 4 winds.
What so few people realize is that you can see the rapture directly after the sun, moon, and star sign in Revelation as well, though there is a kind of interlude after the sign and before the wrath of God. For example, the very next thing we see is an angel saying, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Then these angels go about sealing the 144,000 to protect them from the wrath that is about to come.
You get this interlude in chapter 7, and the interlude is explicitly centered around protecting people from God's judgment. And so it says, don't let any wind blow on the trees and things like that. But before any of that happens, we want you to seal the servants of God on their forehead.
Directly after the 144,000 are sealed, we see the result of the rapture from the viewpoint of heaven. A great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. Revelation 7, verse 9b. We are given the final proof that the pre-wrath view of this timeline is correct a few verses later, when the angel tells John exactly who this group is. These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Revelation 7, verse 14b. Remember, the Great Tribulation is not a 7-year period. Theologically speaking, it is the persecution that begins just after the midpoint and extends until it is cut short by the rapture. This phrase, out of the Great Tribulation, then, confirms the pre-wrath timeline, and it means that the day of the Lord will not begin until after the 6th seal, and that the rapture occurs at some point after the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel, and finally, that the church will face the persecution of the Antichrist before the rapture.
There's a depiction of the church's appearance in heaven, apparently as a means of protecting them from God's wrath, between the arrival of the great day of God's wrath and the actual execution of the great day of God's wrath. That's a pre-wrath rapture.
Regarding this multitude in heaven, pre-tribbers would emphatically declare that this group is not the raptured church, but rather the so-called tribulation saints. But if you press them about why they must be tribulation saints and not the church, they will answer with a classic circular argument. They don't believe the church will be in the Great Tribulation, so this group can't be the church. There are, as far as I know, no other arguments for the existence of the tribulation saints view. You may be wondering why pre-tribulationists believe that the seals in Revelation 6 have to be a part of the day of the Lord's wrath, especially in light of all this evidence to the contrary. Do they have some proof text I'm not telling you about? Not really. The most common defense pre-tribulationists offer is that the seals are the wrath of God, because Jesus opens them. This argument comes from Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, which says, "And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation." They argue essentially that since Jesus was the only one worthy to break the seals and open the scroll, the seals as well as the scroll must be judgment, since in other places in the Bible, Jesus is said to be the only one worthy to judge the world. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't logically follow that just because Jesus is the only one worthy to break the seals and open the scroll, that the seals on the scroll are judgment. This verse in Revelation 5, verse 9 would make just as much sense in the pre-wrath view, in which the scroll's contents, not the seals of the scroll, are the actual judgment. This is often the sole argument from pre-tribulationists to prove that the seals are the wrath of God. And in my opinion, it's rather weak, especially when you compare it to the actual explicit biblical evidence we have seen here. And that brings us to something we have referenced many times in this film, but have yet to fully explain: the pre-trib doctrine